There's translation available. So as we know, the climate is warming, and we are moving into a new future that will depart, the climate will depart from the Holocene and everything humans have ever experienced, and what many organisms on the planet now have going beyond what they have experienced. And as you've been hearing at the COP, fossil fuel emissions continue to rise, even though so much effort has been put into renewables, and there's very encouraging signs as well that some countries have invested a lot in renewables and are no longer increasing their emissions. Some are bending the curve, but globally we still continue to increase our emissions, which means it's going to be a very long time before we bring the climate under control. And the problem with that, in addition to creating stress for organisms due to climate change, is the problem of land and habitat. We've known this since the beginning of ecology, that organisms need space, and when we are not careful and thoughtful for how we put our solar panels, our renewable energy, our hydroelectric energy implementations, we use up space for life on Earth. This is where I'm coming from, Massachusetts and New England and the United States. And because there are these wonderful incentives for people to put in solar panels, they're now cutting down the forest to put the solar panels up. So the point is, without being very thoughtful and careful in our policies for how we promote solutions to climate, we have unintended consequences for biodiversity. And Brazil faces the same trade-offs that we have in North America. There's limited space. There's one planet. We all have to fit on it, and all of life does too. And so what we're seeing globally is biodiversity decline everywhere. This is from the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services all over the planet. Massive declines in birds and animals and plants and fungi. And we barely even know the fungi that we have. Of the mammals, if we measure all the biomass of mammals on planet Earth, only 5% are wild. The rest are humans, our livestock, and our pets. So we have really reduced the space for all the other life on the planet, and that's at the risk of our adaptive capacity and our resilience, our life support systems. So the point of this panel and all of us coming together across 3 continents is to make this point, that if we focus only on climate and manage our ecosystems primarily for carbon, we will lose our life support systems and our planet's adaptive capacity. So if there's one take-home message, it's that we have to co-manage these risks. We have to always be thinking about the resilience of our planet at the same time we're trying to manage the climate. And that's why there is also the Convention on Biodiversity and the United Nations Global Biodiversity Framework. There is a parallel set of conferences of the parties, like the one last year in Cali, that are really focusing on maintaining biodiversity, working with indigenous people to bring them into the conversation and help them maintain their land and stewardship, to conserve land for biodiversity, to restore land, and to address invasive species and many other targets. So I'm going to stop there and have each of us introduce ourselves briefly.
Thanks everyone for coming in, and thanks for Janine for this introduction. My name is Maria Santos. I'm a professor in Earth System Science at the University of Zurich. I come from the remote sensing laboratories, and what we are focusing on is to bring Earth system science to the Anthropocene, so looking into remote sensing opportunities to link humans and biodiversity.
Okay. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, Janine, Maria. My name is Marielos Peñaclaros. I'm a tropical forest ecologist. I'm a Bolivian living in the Netherlands. I work and I work in Wageningen University. My research focuses on sustainable forest management and how can we accelerate the recovery of forests after human impact. And I'm mostly interested on working on science that has an impact on the ground.
The two of them, okay. Well, good afternoon. My name is Carmen Jos. I'm an ecologist as well. I have been working with NGOs for many, many years, all of my professional career, and I am the director of Fundación Ecociencia at Ecuador. Fundación Ecociencia is part of two networks that today are here, and we are doing all these presentations based on our collective and collaborative analysis of data for the whole Amazon basin. And the two networks are Raiski and ANA. So I'm going to present work done by those networks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roshanak Darvish Zadeh. I'm from the University of Twente in the Netherlands. I'm a remote sensing scientist working in the field of biodiversity monitoring. And in particular, I'm working in the field of ecosystem function and ecosystem structure, and how remote sensing data can be used to monitor these indicators of biodiversity and how they are related or affected by climate indicators. I will be moderating the questions today.
Thank you. And how?
So I will go ahead and start the first talk. Can we have the slides back? Okay, while we wait for the slides to come back up. Okay, so I'm Janine Cavender-Bears, and I'm at Harvard, and I will be talking about measuring biodiversity in ecosystems to sustain our life support systems. But first, a question that we always think we know the answer to: what is biodiversity? And what we're really talking about is the variation in life in all of its forms across the entire globe. And the real question is, why does it matter? And once we know why it matters, how do we measure it so that we can keep track of it? It's not like measuring molecules of CO2 in the atmosphere. So here is an example of biodiversity where I'm coming from in New England. This is the Quabbin Reservoir. These are the forests and the organisms that surround the water. The water flows all the way to Boston and is the drinking water supply for millions and millions of people. So one reason we care about biodiversity is because it provides ecosystem services like clean drinking water, like removing carbon from the atmosphere, like preventing erosion. But what we often don't talk about is the importance of biodiversity for adaptive capacity, for the ability to change in response to change. Our life support systems, they are actually complex adaptive systems. Genetic material recombines and adapts to change. We need high genetic diversity, high populations within species, high species that interact with each other in complex ways. That is the basis for our resilience and our adaptive capacity. When we come to measuring biodiversity, we've been measuring biodiversity for many years, and people have proposed important metrics. These include things like species diversity. How many species? Genetic diversity. How much genetic variation within species? Phylogenetic diversity. How much evolution in an area? Functional diversity. How do species respond differently to change? How do they use resources differently? How do they tolerate stress? Ecosystem diversity, all the different kinds of ecosystems that make up landscapes and biomes and our biosphere. Structural complexity, the heterogeneity in ecosystems that provide habitat and variation for all kinds of different organisms. And we look at these metrics across space and time. And there are many reasons why we might care about biodiversity. There is the utilitarian perspective, ecosystem services, there's our cultural connection, and there's also the idea that we emerged from this planet, we evolved from it, and there's also a moral component that there's 3.5 billion years of evolution on planet Earth. This is time on the x-axis. We're at the outer edge of this, the top of the circle. And you can see the radiation of all of these species across the tree of life, the last mass extinction. And we can really ask the question, what right do we have to destroy 3.5 billion years of evolution? So that's another reason that some of us think about biodiversity. Biodiversity includes the many functions. When trees grow, they pull carbon out of the atmosphere, they pull water out of the soil, they move it through their stems, through their leaves, and they influence the hydrologic budget and the movement of water within ecosystems and across biomes, even across continents. There are microbes in the soil that interact with plants. The diversity of that influences the way nutrients move, influences biogeochemical cycles that are global. And there's a massive diversity in the soil that we barely can see that is influencing the nutrient cycles and our biogeochemical cycles. So what I want to emphasize here is the importance of science in understanding what we're doing to our planet and also understanding how restoration can happen in a very science-based way, a very evidence-based way. And so we can take advantage of the tree diversity experiments that have been set up globally, including this one from a graduate student showing that when we plant diverse trees together, trees that function very differently, that respond to stress differently, that grow at different rates, they reduce climate extremes. They buffer the vapor pressure deficit. So there's not as much drought in the air that seedlings are exposed to, and there's less coolness. It's less cold in the winter, so this is in the temperate zone, so there's less stress in the heat and less stress in the cold. As a consequence, they grow more and they're more productive. This is a phenomenon that has been found in experiments around the world for many different reasons, and syntheses of many experiments around the globe show that when we have more diverse plantings, we get greater ecosystem functions in terms of productivity, and the mechanisms may be different. But it's really pronounced in wetter areas over drier areas. And so people have been working very hard, including Regreen here in Brazil. They just won the Earthshot 2025 prize for the restoration work they're doing in the Atlantic forest. and in the Amazon planting millions of trees, trying to get the basic principles of how to do restoration right. And many people around the world have come together to develop these 10 golden rules for restoration that include things like work with local people, make sure you're using appropriate species that grow in the area, make sure the restoration is near places where dispersal can happen into the forest, make sure species can actually be ready to adapt to changing environments, and so forth. Another point I want to make about science, not just for using experiments in which to base our restoration approaches, but also really understanding the biodiversity. It is a lot of work to understand which species are which. There is this story of the Centinela Ridge from Ecuador, where after logging, botanists in the 70s and 80s were worried that all this biodiversity had been lost. And then recently, new scientists came along and they found that some of those species were still there in other fragments in Ecuador, and that many of those species had not actually been lost. But it depended on having the libraries of biodiversity that we house in our biodiversity collections, and a lot of taxonomic work to figure that out. And so I'm actually the director of the Harvard University Herbaria, where we have over 5.5 million specimens. And often people don't understand the value of having these libraries and this information available for people to know what is actually there, what its names are that can be connected to everything we know about those species, how our planet is changing, how the species have been changing. It's the ground truth for biodiversity, these collections. We also have many new ways of monitoring biodiversity, and we're going to emphasize remote sensing here, but I will also make the point that remote sensing only works if we have a great deal of information on the ground about what we're actually measuring from above. And so here's an example of an approach to mapping biodiversity that my team has been working on using hyperspectral data. This is emit data and the DESIS data. These are 30-meter pixels and 60-meter pixels, and we're taking advantage of the US Forest Service forest inventories that have hundreds of thousands of plots all across the United States, measuring the trees in those plots. So we have a high level of information about all the species, their phylogenetic information, and their functional trait information. We can develop ordinations and predict the axes of ordinations using a biodiversity framework. And from that, we get high accuracy models that allow us to map biodiversity at large spatial extents, including the composition of forests, their functional diversity and their functional composition, which traits, and the lineages that occur there. So this gives us a really important way to monitor what our planet looks like at large spatial extents, but it does require a lot of data to build these models, but the satellite data is freely available to build them. I'm also going to highlight the work of my colleague Andrew Davies, who works in Kenya and also in the Congo, using actually very inexpensive methods to measure structural diversity using LiDAR. And they have been developing methods that link structural information to habitat complexity that then predicts bird diversity, and they're working on all the other kinds of animal diversity as well. And they can use that information to build maps of structural complexity that then translate to bird diversity, for example, in this map. And in the Congo, they're now working in the Congo, which is the second largest rainforest and also the least studied, and the only one with its megafauna still intact. And so they're working there with many ground measurements, acoustic measurements, tracking, and using LiDAR data to connect all these measurements to build models of diversity. And finally, I will highlight my colleague Paul Moorcroft's modeling work that combines hyperspectral data and structural data from LiDAR as inputs to dynamic global vegetation models that allow us to predict hydrologic cycles, carbon cycling, climate impacts through time, both backwards and forwards. And the error in these models can be drastically reduced by using remote sensing data to initialize the models. And this allows us to understand the impacts of management strategies that we might put in place. If we take this strategy versus this one, what will the impact be on the hydrology and on the carbon and on the climate? All of this monitoring and ways of using science to understand, as inputs to decision making and to monitor the impacts of our decision making is critical for linking science to action. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And my colleague Maria Santos from the University of Zurich will now be talking about methods for monitoring biodiversity in the Amazon and how it's connected to hydrologic cycles and biodiversity in Africa.
Thanks very much, Janine, for the introduction. And I would like to follow up to bringing us to where we are right now. Is it okay? I would like us to place ourselves where we are. We are at the Amazon. The Amazon has been known for quite some time as a living laboratory for understanding moisture recycling. What is this process? Well, actually, Professor Enias Salatu has discovered this process many, many years ago by looking into stable isotopes of oxygen and tracing them back within the basin and being able to show that the moisture that comes in from the ocean precipitates and then gets evapotranspired about 7 times within the basin extent. And this is the moisture that actually allows us to maintain the forest in a stable state and avoid the tipping element that the Amazon forest is. We've been using moisture tracking models that basically try to predict and try to model this process. And what you see on the top is the average moisture sink and the standard deviation. That means the moisture that actually lands on any grid cell within the Amazon basin. And the moisture source means how much moisture does that grid cell actually provide to precipitation downwind from there. And we've been looking at that for the last 20 years with a time series of 10 of a monthly base, and we basically see that deforestation leads to effects and decreases on moisture recycling up to 72 months after the deforestation event. Why am I talking about moisture? Well, Vox produced this very interesting science communication paper, and they said the trees produce the rain that maintain the trees. That also triggered us to think about the Amazon for its other very important aspect, its biodiversity. Which trees, which functions. You heard already Janine presenting very well how we can actually use tools like remote sensing to assess these at scale, and that's what we've been doing as well. So we started to ask these questions. Which functions deliver this moisture recycling that then maintains the diversity of trees, and which aspects of biodiversity are maintained within the Amazon, and then connecting the dots by those maintaining the climate control and also across continents. If we take an aspect of biodiversity that is this aspect of function, and we want to understand which traits actually are delivering this moisture recycling function, here in this graph I show you some traits that are important, like stomatal conductance, anything that we call hydraulic traits. This is from the TRI database, which is a global database on plant traits. And if you can see the dots on the Amazon maps on these 4 traits, you see that there's very, very few locations where these traits are measured on the ground. The graphs there tells you the variation, and therefore we can see that we lack substantial in situ data to actually do that. But can we do it with remote sensing? And that's what several people have been doing, using different types of platforms to try to scale from this in situ information, linking it to remote sensing data, and then try to assess if there are relationships. So some approaches have been put forward in the last 5 to 8 years on mapping plant functional traits at a global level. So we took some of these maps produced in 2018 over the extent of the Amazon. So you see the maps here for specific leaf area, for leaf dry matter content and leaf phosphorus content. And then we try to assess, are they correlated in some extent with water parameters that link to the water cycle? And we say yes, they do correlate. And what is interesting here is that we took a quantile approach. So we're not just looking at average behavior, but actually the extreme behavior if we change the environment to have low trait values or high trait values. The values of the traits is what we can manage, not necessarily the rivers on the sky. So what we see is that if we actually change the trait values, we're going to substantially change the moisture recycling that maintains the forest. But moreover, we can also start to use remote sensing to ask these other questions about biodiversity in the Amazon. This picture here tells us what is the diversity of spectral profiles that we can use and measure with remote sensing. And what the colors tell you, the warm colors are the spectral profiles that are more dissimilar to their neighbor spectral profiles. And the cold colors in blue and green are those that are more similar. For those of you familiar with the Amazon, you can see that the most dissimilar ones coincide with these very hydrodynamic locations. And happy to show you that we've been able to do this now at scale for the entire Amazon. It's still a very colorful picture. We lack validation because this in situ validation is still lacking, but we can now already start to do this using multispectral data. Of course, this comes with certain limitations. We know that we have a time series of Landsat data that has cloud cover that limits, depending on where you are in the Amazon, it limits the quality, but it's a good starting point to start to show us the patterns of biodiversity, its underlying functions, and how do they relate to these very important global processes that regulate our climate. Why are they important? Here's a satellite footage that tracks moisture, that basically shows where the moisture from the Amazon goes and where the moisture from the Congo Basin goes. So this shows you that actually these processes are way more connected than we tend to think about. So I started us by looking into the Amazon, but it's not just about the Amazon. It's that these intercontinental connections that are very much dependent on the biodiversity and the management at local scales. For the Congo Basin, we started to plot this time series. In this case, is the evaporation shed. So anything that is evaporated, so any molecule of water that is evaporated from the Congo Basin, where does it land? So we have been starting to analyze this data for the last 20 years at a monthly resolution. And this is the precipitation shed. Where is the precipitation that lands on the Congo Basin coming from? The point here is to show that even if we manage a place locally or very distantly, or if we think about processes like restoration, they are extremely interconnected up and downstream. They are extremely interconnected much beyond what the biodiversity functions in any given location deliver. So if you think about, for example, restoration options for Africa, those are the maps in here, and those are, for example, some of the moisture evaporation sheds for some of the countries. If we think about the options, we see that, for example, Tanzania and Angola are very dependent on themselves. The Congo Basin is also very dependent on the moisture flows. And we cannot think about restoration options just based on projections, like in the right-hand side, on land use change, on temperature and precipitation. We need to think about the connections. We need to think about the connections on the ground, on the sky, and across continents. To finalize, this is the last map that I wanted to show you. Anything in green is precipitation that emerges from evaporation in a forest. Anything in red are pixels whose precipitation emerges from short vegetation, and anything in blue in the continental aspect is precipitation that comes from the ocean. Thinking about this conference here, we cannot manage, of course, the precipitation that comes from the ocean. That will be maintained. But we can and we should manage the precipitation that comes from land, being it the forest or the short vegetation. So it shows you a very large fraction of our terrestrial cover is dependent on what we do on the ground, and is very dependent on these functions that biodiversity that we seldom know and deliver for all of us. So with that, I would like to conclude that we are changing species compositions functions with planetary implications. We need to think about beyond the silos in which we have been talking about. The picture there is the recent IPBES Nexus assessment that starts to think about the nexus between biodiversity, health, food, water, and climate. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
So next, Dr. Marielos Peñas Clara from the science panel of the Amazon and Wageningen University will be talking more about connectivity within the Amazon, and not just connectivity between biogeochemical cycles, but also with people, and connecting that to potential tipping points.
Thank you for the introduction, and also thank you to the two previous presenters, because they have really set up the perfect stage for my presentation. Again, my name is Marielos Peña. I forgot to mention that I'm the co-chair of the Science Panel for the Amazon, and that's actually the only reason for me to be here. So I think as you heard from the presentation of Maria, the Amazon is really the place, it's a very good example where biodiversity, climate, and connectivity come together. And what I will be talking is about the science and what can we do with science for a living planet. So if I could have my presentation, that would be fantastic. I need to do this. Okay, sorry. Yes, okay, here's the title. As I mentioned earlier, I'm actually here representing the Science Panel for the Amazon. The Science Panel for the Amazon is the first regional high-level initiative dedicated to the Amazon. And its mission is really to summarize, to synthesize the information available in the literature, including gray literature, and put that scientific information together with the indigenous knowledge and knowledge of local people. So we're trying, since the beginning, we are trying to put all these different forms of knowledge together to be able to come up with recommendations for the Amazon that guarantee a sustainable development for this very important ecosystem. The Amazon is, we all know that the Amazon is a very rich system. About 13% of all these terrestrial species that you find in the world are actually found in the Amazon. It is also a system that has a very large diversity of ecosystems, and all these different ecosystems are connected with each other. So we need to think about the Amazon as an interconnected system that needs this interconnectedness to be able to function properly. As it was already mentioned as well, the Amazon plays a very important role for carbon sequestration, and it stores a lot of carbon. And what I think it's something that and I think the talk of Janine was very good, and both the previous talks highlight is biodiversity is a key component for the resilience of the Amazon. So we cannot see, what we see really is that this biodiversity is the central axis of the Amazon, and we can, and what we see is that the areas where you have a higher diversity of species, that those are going to be much more able to adapt and to resist all the changes that are going on. Again, I want to show you an example. This map is much less cool than the map that Maria showed. This is a recent study talking about the flying rivers, and it shows with the arrows where actually the water is moving around in the Amazon. So you get humidity coming from the Atlantic Ocean, falling as rain, being recycled, and when that humidity hits the Andes, there are regions where 40 to 50% actually of that water is actually coming from water recycled from forest. 40 to 50%. It's amazing. And that's why, and we see already that in cities like Bogota, scarcity of water because of deforestation in the Amazon. They were rationalizing water there for more than 1 year. The same in Quito. So all this system is connected. And I just learned today, and I thought I would write it down, the atmosphere is bringing 6,400 cubic kilometers of water per year through the atmospheric rivers. That water falls, goes down, comes back to Belén, so to say, and the amount of water that comes back is about the same. It's about 6,600 cubic kilometers of water per year that comes and goes down. And that has a lot of influences because that water allows longitudinal connectivity. It allows temporal connectivity because some areas are flooding in some parts of the year. It has had a major influence in diversity in diversity. So you find that the Amazon has one of the highest diversity of fish species. And it's also extremely important, all that dynamic of water, for ribereños communities that live along that river. Probably you don't know, but the Amazon people have one of the highest consumption of fishes around the world. I think it's about 500 grams per capita that people consume. It's really a huge amount. But we all know that the Amazon is under threat and that there is a large risk of a tipping point. And that losing the Amazon will really have a very large impact on ecosystem services, on cascading effects, on regional and global effects. For example, due to deforestation, a recent study has shown that some areas, if deforestation in Brazil continues, some areas in Bolivia and Peru will suffer the most because they will become much larger. But if you remember this very cool video of Maria, all this humidity was going towards the southern part. So that has a lot of influence for all the agricultural production in southern Bolivia, northern Argentina, southern Brazil. So much that another recent study, among others, Marina Hirota, showed that about 80% if she takes into account indigenous territories and the humidity that comes from those indigenous territories from Brazil, what she finds is that water feeds 80% of the agricultural land in Brazil. 80%. Basically, agricultural, small or larger scale in Brazil should be the ones really promoting the conservation of the Amazon because their economies depend on the water that comes from protected areas and indigenous territories. Talking about connectivity. So in the report that we launched, and I have been talking the whole week about the report because I'm very proud of the work that we did with about 140 people, is that we focus on connectivity. And we have looked into connectivity both ecological and socio-cultural. So you see on one side the ecological system, on the other side you see the socio-cultural system. But these systems in the Amazon, they are totally connected. So we had a lot of trouble making this figure because if you think about the socio-ecological systems that figures that we have so far, they put 2 blocks linked with an arrow. That's not the reality in the Amazon. They are interwave. They depend on each other. And that's what we portray here with this infinite curve going around, because they basically, communities depend for their livelihoods on the ecological systems. They have shaped the Amazon. Think about chocolate, Brazil nut, acai. That's domestication that happened for many years. And so there is an interaction, and that interaction is also being observed through the beliefs and cultures and management practices from indigenous people and local communities. So they're really very much interlinked, and we need to think about the Amazon in such a way when we define or when we want to come with recommendations for its conservation. So in the chapter, we tackle few of the multitude of dimensions that you have in connectivity. We cover 8 of them. I have 2 minutes, Nina? Yes? In some chapters, we really look into this more global, regional connectivity. Think about aerial rivers. In the chapters 6 and 7, more towards the end of this very nice diagram, we focus more on potential solutions. What can we do? And one important aspect of that is socio-bioeconomy, and is the design of landscapes that are productive but with multiple functions. And the key component of that is the role of indigenous people and local people who have been managing these systems for a long time, and that they have systems of managing that in a sustainable way. So in the last chapter that you see there, we discuss about how can we interweave, how can we dialogue. I love this expression in Spanish, diálogo de saberes. Is more than a conversation of knowledge, because saberes implies something more than knowledge. But how do we do that? How do we create this intersection between academic science and indigenous science? How do we communicate with that? The key component of that, I think, is that we need to sit together and we need to listen to each other in a very humble way. And in that way, we can maybe come up with very creative solutions that will allow us to conserve the Amazon. And something that I think is also very innovative for a science report are the calls to actions. The calls to actions focus on specific topics. And we include here, and I need to read, for example, we talk about fund, connect, and strengthen science for a living Amazon. So we describe the problem, and then in a later section of the document, in the solution space, we highlight initiatives that are already going on in the Amazon, with the hope that those initiatives will inspire other people to repeat, to implement, to adapt, to change to their local situations. But we thought that there are really a lot of initiatives, sometimes too small, but with a lot of potential, and they need to be highlighted. And these are the 5 recommendations, but I think I will stop here because my time is up. Thank you.
Next, we have Carmen Jos, who's the director of Fundación Ecociencia, and she will continue to talk about connectivity in the Amazon and changes, land use change, drastic land use changes that have gone on, and the implications of that.
Thank you very much, Janine. Okay, my presentation will be about a research that we recently finished as a collaborative initiative of two networks, ANA and RISE, which are composed or formed by national organizations, NGOs of the Amazon countries. This analysis about connectivity, the study that we just finished, uses as an input an important map, or it's not only a map, it's rather a collection of maps of almost 40 years, showing the land use change in all those 40 years. Those maps come from another network, which is Map Biomas. Map Biomas network is now working on all of the Latin American countries mostly, all of the South American for sure, producing in a standard and with standard protocols the land use change data annually based on Landsat satellite imagery. So we have here the result of those 40 years of data showing what has been the change in the Amazon basin. It's not only the biome, but the basin, and I stress that out because we are here not only talking about forests, but also other very important ecosystems which are predominant in the headwaters of the Amazon basin. So the change has been huge. Actually, 17%, I think there's an error here in the number of 0.9%. In reality, the loss, those number of hectares lost over these 40 years mean 17% of loss of natural covers, natural vegetation cover. Anyway, we use that information. We use that information because we wanted to use it as an input for the analysis of connectivity loss over the same time. This other map is showing basically how the indigenous territories and the protected areas work as barriers to this intense change of land use that some places of the Amazon are going through. This is just a picture to show how in some places of the Amazon, some of the most intensive change that we were seeing in the animated maps before are due to huge agro-industry transformation. And this picture shows you how there are only, in that kind of landscape, there are only small or very narrow corridors for the movement of species. So the analysis we did using, as I said, the land use change maps over 40 years also introduces the methodology of with an algorithm of circuit theory, where the nodes basically are the places with natural vegetation remnants, forest or other type of natural vegetation. And that is what the model tries to connect. We use as criteria for connection the movement requirements of different types of animals, of species that have different ranges of movement across the landscape. And finally, together, using that and the transformed landscape, we can come up with results of different levels of connectivity, actually using in the model, as I said, different types of, or ecotypes corresponding to different movement ranges. I will run through this because there is not enough time to explain all that what we are seeing, but basically here is an example of change around an indigenous territory here in Brazil, which shows on the one hand, in the case of land use change, how the territory becomes isolated over the time, surrounded completely by a converted landscape. This map, this animation shows, in the case of that same territory, the result of the analysis of connectivity. So we are not looking now at land conversion, but we are looking in the brown, more dark colors, loss of connectivity. Places where, for these species that were analyzed in the model, the movement is not possible anymore. And in the lighter colors, beige colors, that shows places where the movement is very diminished, so it's degraded or diminished connectivity. Part of the driver of that loss of connectivity, of course, is the building, the development of more and more infrastructure. A lot of it related, in this case, we're showing roads, which in turn, over time, are related with drastic conversion of the landscape for different economic activities, mostly agro-industry. So we did also the analysis based on the results of loss of connectivity on these units, which are so important for conservation and for maintaining connectivity, units of management that are indigenous territories and protected areas. And what we can see is that some of them, the ones in the orange color, are losing probably the inside those areas, inside those units, there is still forest. It's not that they have lost or their natural vegetation completely, but all their surroundings are already transformed and have lost connectivity, and the red units are the ones that, in spite of being protected areas or indigenous territories, have lost completely the potential or the possibility of working as movement spaces for biodiversity. So there has been definitively a problem with my slides, so I'm struggling a bit here, but so I'll go faster, and I would like to go to the recommendations, which are in Spanish now, but okay. So all this information and other information of connectivity as an important criterion for planning, for future infrastructure planning as well, because we know that what is left in terms of areas with high level of connectivity is also, of course, or will be the most biodiverse areas as well. So this has many implications. Also, use connectivity as an indicator for NBSAPs especially, and also for NDCs. I think there is the possibility of of looking at this synergy of the two things that are reuniting us here today, biodiversity and connectivity. And I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
You to play this. So we're going to go now to the African continent, where Moses Cho is a leader in remote sensing biodiversity, and he'll talk about amazing body of work and progress that's been made for land management using remote sensing tools. And apologies that he couldn't be here today. There were travel complications.
Greetings from South Africa, colleagues. I'm Moses Azonte. I'm a chief researcher in the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research here in Pretoria, South Africa. I'm also a professor of remote sensing in the Plant and Soil Science Department of the University of Pretoria. It's unfortunate I couldn't make it to Belém, and I want to thank my colleagues Janine and Roshanak for inviting me to be part of this discussion on science-informed strategies to advance climate and biodiversity goals. And my topic of presentation is titled Leveraging Earth Observation Technologies to Support Thresholds of Potential Concern, TPC-based adaptive biodiversity management in South Africa. And what is the TPC concept all about? It is a concept that was developed in South Africa as a framework for adaptive management of biodiversity by the South African national parks, SAN parks, primarily within the Kruger National Park, which is the biggest national park in the country by land size. The TPC is an evidence-based level or point of change in an ecological indicator. It could be a habitat condition trait beyond which there is a high risk of rapid or potentially irreversible negative changes to biodiversity or to changes to an ecological function. With rapid changes in land use and the impacts of climate change, there is a chance that some of the important ecological traits or functional traits could be degraded beyond, let's say, the point of no return. So the park is very concerned about that, and I've developed this framework to ensure that we don't get over those tipping points. And we are supporting this concept through mapping of what we call essential biodiversity variables, the EBV concept that was developed by Joe Bond. As a way of having important variables that can be used to monitor changes in biodiversity across the globe, mainly due to the changing climate and land use systems across the world. And so we were one of the earliest adopters of the EPV concept, and we started exploring, the use of different remote sensing technologies and approaches on mapping these EPVs and how we can assist the South African National Park authorities to map changes in biodiversity. So my presentation basically would be a slideshow of some of the examples of EPVs that we have explored and mapped, and are assisting the authorities with evidence to support the TPC adaptive management framework. Here we explored the use of hyperspectral data, LiDAR data, high-resolution world view data. The utility of this data set for mapping tree species at individual tree level. And the map on the left there shows tree species map across the Kruger, a gradient across the Kruger National Park and a neighboring communal area. We're able to demonstrate that with a combination of hyperspectral data and LiDAR data, you can actually map tree species down to the individual tree level. And we extended that approach into a closed canopy forest along the eastern coast of South Africa. It's a subtropical humid forest. And we're able to map the individual tree species there in the forest, the very dominant ones. Okay, we could not map the very rare species within the forest, but we could really map almost all of the dominant tree species in the forest. And the maps reveal some very important patterns and even some disturbing trends within the forest. And we've published quite a good number of papers on the techniques and approaches that were used. Here we have explored the new theory that is coming up within the remote sense of biodiversity space, looking at the relationship between spectral diversity and species diversity. So I had a PhD, or my PhD students, Sabelo Madonzela, explored the relationship between your Landsat variables, spectral variables, and some of the species indices, your Simpson and Shannon, and was able to derive some relationships that were then used to map the distribution of or the variability of Shannon index across the Kruger National Park. And the products were validated. It is quite interesting that concept is working, and that concept we now currently extending that concept into the Fernbush biome in the eastern Cape province of or the Western Cape province of South Africa, and working with our colleagues with NASA, who are developing a new sort of index, a spectral index, and we've already published, we've had a publication on that. So you see that the first beta diversity result over the Cape Peninsula, intrinsic dimensionality and spectral diversity. And other variables like your landscape chemistry, mapping the nutrient concentration in your rangeland. This is very important because animals don't just move around eating everything. Usually they go for nutritive forage or browsing resources. And so providing this map of the chemistry of the landscape helps the park managers to assess the conditions, the carrying capacity of the landscape. So my colleague, Professor Abel Ramilo, did quite some work on this, and we've provided all of this information to the park authorities. And it's interesting that even Abel worked as a scientific expert within the park, using all of this information for rangeland management. We have also explored other sensing instrument or devices, your synthetic aperture radar, and its utility for mapping tree structural attributes, your canopy cover, height, biomass. And we've had quite a good number of publications and even some collaboration with the JEDI program, contributing the data to global mapping of canopy cover and forest biomass. So those are some of the products and maps from that work. We've also delved into mapping of invasive species within the protected areas of the country. You can find on the left side there a probability map of the invasion of Cromolina odorata in a protected area, and on the right hand side, that is mapping black wattle, which is an important invasive in the country. We've even developed a semi-automated method for mapping this invasive at any time for any landscape in the country, and those are the publications there that demonstrate or highlight the methods that have been developed. We've extended this work, working with our colleagues from NASA and many US institutions, more than 40 institutions, into the Cape Floristic region, one of the richest biodiversity hotspots in the world. NASA has deployed a range of sensors from hyperspectral, LiDAR, synthetic aperture radar, thermal, hyperspectral sensors, and we're exploring the utility of these sensors for mapping the essential biodiversity variables in this landscape. And all of this work is in preparation for future spaceborne missions of these high-end sensors. And we've also done work on remote sensing of ecosystem functional traits, your energy balance parameters, evapotranspiration, and you can find some of those publications from my colleague, Dr. Nobule Majosi. So we really embarked on this process of exploring the use of remote sensing technologies, Earth observation technologies, different kind, from your optical sensors, your active sensors, your radar, your LiDAR, and we're looking at both, multispectral, hyperspectral, and assessing, the potential to provide the evidence that can support the TPC adaptive management strategies of biodiversity. This is very important to ensure that none of the variable goes above the tipping point. I think I would like to end there and again thank everyone, and I hope this presentation was clear enough, and all the best for the workshop. Thank you.
So after hearing this suite of talks from across the Americas and Africa and their connectivity, the connectivities within continents, between biogeochemical cycles, water, and people, we now have the opportunity to think about the future and how we co-manage the risks of biodiversity and climate. And Roshanak is going to moderate question and answer session, and we hope you have questions for us, and we also have our own questions in case you don't.
Very much, Janine, and all the speakers today for insightful talks about biodiversity, connectivity, and the impact of biodiversity and climate. I would like to invite the audience to ask questions. If there is any questions from audience, I prefer to start with your questions. Of course, I have a long list of questions myself as well, but I would like to start with you. If you have any questions for our speakers, yes, please.
So I heard some talk, I was at the Biodiversity COP last year, and heard some talk about uniting the climate biodiversity COPs. Is that something that has any potential? Will that happen? That seems like a natural way to start to unite the two things.
I don't actually know, but I think holding this COP in Belém was intended to do that very thing. And I hope from here forward, we are thinking about these at the same time, because it really is, the whole point of this session was to highlight the grave problems we face if we just continue to increase our use of energy, no longer by fossil fuels, but now by renewables. That just takes up space. And if we don't carefully manage the space, we've got one planet, and all of life depends on the habitat on that planet. So we have to be really careful how we use that space. One planet, one Earth. How do we manage our planet so that people have sustainable livelihoods? we don't lose our adaptive capacity and resilience, we maintain the rest of life, and it's still a habitable planet for humanity. How do we do that?
Maybe I can add something to that question. There are ongoing attempts to have IPCC and IPBES talk more and have the COPs cooperating more. There was a document, there was a report that was co-authored by both IPCC and IPBES, so the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services one. And there's at least several papers coming in from the ecosystem modeling, from the climate modeling, and from the biodiversity, looking at the two sides and how we can integrate them. So I'm still hopeful that more communication will happen between the two COPs, even if they don't happen concurrently.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I fully support this, and I think if you look at the Amazon in the way that we are looking in this, with these 4 networks working on connectivity, it separates having a climate discussion and having a biodiversity discussion doesn't make sense because of the connections that are there. And also, if you want to know more about the work that we are doing for the 4 networks, we have these beautiful bookmarkers that you can get, and then you can download our 3 reports. And I think if you look into it also from an ecological point of view, a scientific point of view, this separation is a separation that actually shouldn't be there, in the sense that carbon is an ecosystem service that is there because of biodiversity. So this relation between the two, and it doesn't matter how you measure. I mean, Janine provided all these different ways of measuring biodiversity. If you look into this, all the ecological theories are talking about the relation between productivity and biodiversity. And one way or the other, we divided them to discuss them in separated silos. So I think we really need to push that agenda much stronger and much more clear. And I will add to that component water, because that's the next step. And that also depends on biodiversity. So, and water talks much more to people. I mean, imagine yourself without taking a shower coming here, or without your coffee or your tea, and with this heat in this place, we have been consuming a lot of water. So I think that we do need to put these agendas together, and I think it's a responsibility of each of us to do that and to really push our governments to go that way, because at the end, they do represent us.
Thank you very much for the comprehensive response. I hope you have satisfied with the answers. Is there any other questions from the audience, please?
Hi, thank you very much for very interesting presentations. I think it's a concern by many, but if you see the size of this COP, to take the 2, I haven't been to the biodiversity COPs, but take the 2 together will be an immense difficulty, I think. Then on the science part, the IPBES, their reports and CC, their reports, there is a connection, and also state parties, actually they say that, of course, biodiversity loss depends on back and forth. They say that, but I am a lawyer, so you need to implement one convention at a time. If we cannot implement Paris Agreement, we didn't get adaptation targets now for the adaptation reports. Please, this is the road to hell, according to me. Now I'm personally saying too, but that science take into account both and that is highlighted. You have also a convention from 1992, the CBD, and you have a convention and Paris Agreement for 2015. The knowledge basis for those two conventions is quite different, I would say. But I have another question, so that is my comment on your comments. I think that is, for me, a hellish scenario. For you, perhaps a dream. I don't want to be part of it. But the question about how to coordinate when we have epistemic injustice in the world. Nobody really listens to each other, and you don't listen to the indigenous peoples or local communities in particular. How will you, when you're saying that we should go together, how will you arrange institutionally or practically those arrangements where you have advanced science telling certain things about biomass or whatever it is, and you have indigenous people's local science and cultural science? And how will you, in practical terms, get these two things to talk together? I think it is a problem if we are not going for absolute self-determination of the indigenous peoples and we put the rest out. But still, they need to listen to somebody and we need to listen to them. But how to do it? I would like to have your informed points of view. I come from the University of Oslo. I'm from the law faculty.
Saying that these two agendas should go together, it didn't mean that it will be easy. I agree with you that it may be very difficult. But how to do this? This is something that we, in the Science Panel for the Amazon, we have been trying to do from the beginning, is to really include in our discussions, in the definition of our reports and documents, indigenous people and representatives of local communities and Afro-descendant people. In the case of the Amazon, it is easier to find interlocutores, to find with whom to talk when you think about indigenous people, because they are much more organized than traditional local communities. But the way to do it is really to sit together and to listen. And I want to give the word to André Junqueira or to Jaime Serrano, who are actually working with the Science Panel for the Amazon and all these other networks exactly on asking that. How do we dialogue with each other? And maybe they will have a bit more lessons to share with us than I do.
Thanks, Marielos. Yeah, thanks for giving us the opportunity to talk a bit more about this. So as Marielos said, this has been a mission of the panel since the beginning. And I think the first thing that the panel has done in that sense is to invite members of indigenous peoples and local communities as authors of the report. So having them together with us and building all this content, I think it's a very important step. And I think it has also a philosophical meaning in the sense of looking at knowledge systems as something that can equally contribute to enhancing our understanding of the Amazon. So I think but in practical ways, the first step was to actually invite them to the table of knowledge co-production. On this recent report, there is also one whole chapter that is actually led by members of these communities. So the protagonists of this chapter is them. And also, as part of this report, there is also a sub-report that we've produced with messages that have been selected specifically for this audience, selected by themselves as well. So we know that this is a huge challenge, especially in practical terms. Not all scientists are comfortable in this arena, but the science panel is willing to embrace this endeavor. And we have been receiving some very positive feedback from the members of these communities because they feel that they have been listened. And I think that open, active listening, horizontal, ethical way of looking into different knowledge systems, I think it's a very important initial step in that direction.
Thank you very much. I would like to move on to other topics because we have to address a couple of them. So I would like to ask Professor Maria Santos, a question because she, in her talk, discussed the use of remote sensing and a few nice examples of how remote sensing has been used for biodiversity monitoring. So my question, Maria, is to you is that how can remote sensing actually help us to monitor whether restoration is actually improving ecosystem connectivity and functional diversity rather than just increasing the green pixels in a map? What is your perspective on this?
Thanks very much for the question. So remote sensing has become an emerging technology. So in order to understand how restoration is actually delivering what it is delivering, I think there's a few things that we need to consider. First, we need to train much more capacity to actually use remote sensing in a very creative way to assess change. Then, what kind of change can we assess? We need very good quantifications of the uncertainty of the products that we are producing with remote sensing to make sure that when we think about temporal dynamics, what we measure as change is really change and not different properties because the data was collected in different points in time with different qualities. And then restoration, I think globally we have a few places where we've had more than 10 years of restoration. So many of these places are still very young. So being able to measure that change, of course you measure greenness. And greenness means that, well, something has changed. Whether we have delivered the functions come much later in time. So we need time to be able to monitor restoration. And if we're thinking about functional connectivity, it's a flux and not a compartment. So we need to think about movement of functionality across the landscape with certain spatial arrangements.
Thank you very much, Maria. I would like to move on to Carmen, maybe with, again, following up on the restoration topic. Where do you see the strongest opportunity to combine restoration and ecological connectivity instead of treating them in separate agendas?
Thank you. Well, I don't think they are separate agendas or that they cannot be treated together. For instance, in our study, we propose specific areas for restoration because we are taking into account the dynamics of land use change, the time since it has happened, and other criteria in the case of our study, the movement of species. And we, based on that, and of course we can insert or include there other criteria, we, I think, have made the first step to show areas that are important for restoration precisely to restore connectivity as well. So that restoration is not done on a vacuum, just of mere opportunity, but evidence-based. And basically, I think that's the answer. I mean, we have already measured or tried to come up with an indicator of diminished connectivity, also of connectivity loss. So based on that and many more things, we can decide where to do restoration.
Thank you very much, Carmen. I would like to move to Janine. Janine, in your perspective, what would be or how a successful restoration project that combine the climate benefits will look like? Is it more biomass, more species diversity, or more livelihood, or more carbon? What is your priority and why?
So I like to approach this from a sustainability perspective where we are thinking about all of those issues. We're thinking about human well-being. We're thinking about a complex adaptive system that's maintaining the genetic diversity within species, that has all the species to create the food webs. And we're thinking about dispersal, long distances, movement, connectivity. And when we do all that, we will have a resilient system that will also be able to bounce back after disturbance, after change, and that will give us our best chance of regulating climate by having resilient ecosystems. So, in my view, we have to think about all of those things at the same time. If we just plant eucalyptus forests to get the fastest growing trees, to get early carbon, we'll lose the resilience of our forests, we'll lose the diversity, they won't have the resilience and the adaptive capacity. So you can see what's happened on the landscape when we do it one way or another. We get really different systems.
Thank you very much, Janine. And I would like to now move to Marielos on the question that, Marielos, if you could put only one biodiversity and one climate indicator on a minister dashboard for the next 10 years, what would you choose and why? One climate indicator.
I will be very provocative. I will put water as an indicator of both.
Okay, thank you very much. Short. My time is passing by quickly, so I would like to ask all the speakers to come up with one concrete recommendation for the negotiators and the agreement that will be signed next week. I start with Janine.
So when we talk about land management, it should be land management for carbon. It should be biodiversity aware land management.
So for me, what I think that we could aim for is to think about the underpinning influence of biodiversity on all the regulation of climate processes.
My recommendation for the negotiators will be to take time to go to a forested area in Belém, Museo Goldi, or any other forested area, walk without the telephone, and connect with the trees, connect with the forest, and as a very wise indigenous leader told us, try to listen to the forest, because that will bring a connection and hopefully a peace of mind that when they come back to work, you are the negotiators, and that will be the recommendation. And what was the other?
One concrete recommendation for the negotiators.
Yeah, because then when they come, after this walk in the forest, when they come back to the negotiation tables here, maybe they will feel inspired to sit and listen. Listen carefully to the others, to be able to build together a sustainable future for this world.
Well, I was going to say stop deforestation, basically. Stop transformation. Use more wisely the resources we have, the land that is already converted, and think about it in an integrated way, basically.
Thank you very much, all of you. I would now would like to ask Janine to close the session.
I want to thank all of you for coming and staying the full time. I learned quite a bit in this session about connectivity, about integrating biodiversity and people in the context of climate change, the new methods we have, but also connecting to people, the people that have been living for millennia in ecosystems with deep knowledge of how they work and how to give back to them, how to steward them with reciprocity. And so I thank all of you for listening and thinking about these issues of how biodiversity and climate are connected and what we can do to maintain a habitable planet. Thank you.
If you haven't gotten one, please, we have many of them. Also take them for your colleagues, friends,